If you've ever loved someone so much that you gave up everything just to be near them, then this story is going to hit you harder than you expect. Miriam Cole had nothing: a torn coat, a cardboard sign, a spot on the sidewalk outside the iron gates of the biggest house in Savannah. But when a young lawyer dug into the property records of that house, she found something impossible. The deed had Miriam's name on it, and what happened next shattered 30 years of lies. Good to have you here, friends. Please like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Tell us where you're joining from in the comments. Atlanta, London, maybe Ghana or Barbados? We're curious. Now, what I'm about to tell you is going to make you angry. And it should. Because this woman deserved so much better than what she got. And the person who took everything from her wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a thief on the street. It was the woman who sat across from her at the dinner table every Sunday for 12 years and smiled at her and called her daughter. That's the kind of cruelty I'm talking about. The kind that wears lipstick and pearls and shakes your hand at church. This story starts with Miriam Cole. Or rather, it starts with who Miriam Cole used to be. Because the woman sitting on that sidewalk was not the woman she was born as. She was what someone had turned her into. And there is a world of difference between those two things. Miriam was 63 years old. She was a thin woman, too thin, with bones you could see through her skin at the wrists and collarbones. Her hair was gray and matted, and she kept it tucked under a knitted cap that she had found in a donation bin outside a Goodwill 3 winters ago. The cap was brown. It had a hole near the left ear. She wore it every day regardless of the weather because it kept the sun off her face in summer and the cold off her scalp in winter. And because, if she was honest, it hid the places where her hair had thinned from years of poor nutrition and stress and sleeping in places that no human being should sleep. She wore a coat that had once been navy blue but had faded to a grayish color that didn't have a name. The zipper was broken. She held it closed with a safety pin at the chest and another at the waist. Under the coat, she wore whatever she had found that week. A t-shirt from a church clothing drive. A pair of men's pants she had rolled at the ankles. Shoes that didn't match. One brown boot with a worn sole. One black sneaker with the laces missing. Miriam sat on the same spot every day. Every single day for 30 years. On the sidewalk outside a wrought iron gate on Forsyth Park Road in Savannah, Georgia. The gate was black iron, tall, with ornamental scrollwork at the top and stone columns on either side. Beyond the gate was a driveway lined with live oak trees draped in Spanish moss. At the end of the driveway was a house. Not just a house, a mansion. White columns, a wraparound porch, windows that reflected the sky like mirrors. The kind of house that tour buses slowed down for. The kind of house that made people on the sidewalk stop and stare and say, "Can you imagine living in a place like that?" Miriam could imagine it. She had lived in it. But that was 30 years ago. And 30 years is a long time. Long enough to forget. Long enough to be forgotten. Long enough for the truth to be buried so deep that nobody even knows there's something underground. Every morning, Miriam walked to that gate at 7 o'clock. She sat down on the sidewalk with her back against the stone column. She placed a cardboard sign in front of her legs. The sign said, in handwriting that was shaky but clear, "Anything helps. God bless." She had a paper cup next to the sign. Sometimes people put coins in it, sometimes dollar bills, sometimes nothing. She sat there until 6 in the evening, 11 hours, every day, in the rain, in the heat, in the cold. She sat there because this was her spot. This was where she belonged. Even though nobody believed her, she had a habit of pressing her hand against the iron bars of the gate when she thought nobody was watching. Just pressing her palm flat against the metal, feeling it. Cold in winter, hot in summer, always solid, always there. She would close her eyes and press her hand against the gate and stay like that for a minute or two, her lips moving slightly, like she was talking to the house, or maybe to someone inside it. The people in the neighborhood knew her as the Gate Woman. That's what they called her, not with cruelty, but with the casual indifference that is sometimes worse than cruelty. She was part of the scenery, part of the landscape, as permanent and as overlooked as the oak trees and the moss. Nobody asked her name. Nobody asked her story. Nobody wondered why a homeless woman had chosen this particular gate out of all the gates in Savannah to sit outside of for 3 decades. Nobody except a young woman named Desiree Palmer. But what happened next changed everything. Now let me tell you who Miriam Cole used to be. Because that woman on the sidewalk was not always that woman. Pay close attention now. Miriam was born Miriam Atchison in 1960 in a small town called Jessup, Georgia, about 80 miles west of Savannah. Her father was a school teacher. Her mother was a seamstress who worked from home, taking in alterations and making dresses for women in town who wanted something nicer than what the department store offered. They lived in a modest house with a vegetable garden and a porch swing and a kitchen that always smelled like cinnamon because Miriam's mother baked a cinnamon cake every Saturday for the church bake sale. Miriam was smart, sharp with numbers, quick with words. She graduated top of her class in high school and got a scholarship to study business at Savannah State University. She was the first person in her family to go to college. Her mother sewed her 3 new dresses for the occasion. Her father drove her to campus in his pickup truck and walked her to the dormitory and carried her suitcase up 2 flights of stairs and stood in her room and looked around and said, "You're going to do something special, Miriam. I can feel it." He was right. Miriam graduated with honors. She got a job at a real estate development firm in Savannah. She was 22 years old, sharp, hungry, and determined. Within 3 years, she had her real estate license. Within 5 years, she was managing properties. Within 8 years, she had saved enough to buy her first investment property, a small duplex on the south side that she renovated herself on weekends, painting walls and sanding floors and learning plumbing from YouTube videos that didn't exist yet and library books that did. By the time Miriam was 30, she owned 11 properties, duplexes, small apartment buildings, a commercial space on Bull Street that she leased to a coffee shop. She was making more money than her father had made in his entire career. She was careful with it. She saved. She reinvested. She didn't buy expensive clothes or fancy cars. She bought buildings. Because buildings were solid. Buildings stayed. Buildings didn't leave you. At 31, Miriam bought the house on Forsyth Park Road. That house. The white columns, the wraparound porch, the live oaks, the iron gate. She bought it at auction from a family that had fallen into debt. She paid $460,000 for it, which was everything she had plus a mortgage she could barely afford. She stood in the empty foyer on the day she got the keys, and she looked up at the chandelier and the curved staircase and the 12-foot ceilings, and she pressed her hand against the wall and felt the plaster, solid and cool. And she said out loud to nobody, "This is mine." She spent 2 years renovating it. She did most of the work herself. She stripped wallpaper, she refinished the hardwood floors on her hands and knees. She repaired the plaster moldings in the parlor with a putty knife and a patience that would have exhausted a saint. She planted the garden. She repaired the gate. She polished the brass hardware on the front door until it gleamed. That house became her masterpiece, her proof. Proof that a girl from Jessup, whose mother sewed dresses for a living, could own the biggest house on one of the finest streets in Savannah. And that was only the beginning. At 33, Miriam met a man named Warren Cole. Warren was 38. He was handsome, charming. He had a voice like warm molasses and a smile that made you trust him before he'd finished his first sentence. He was a contractor. He told Miriam he specialized in historic renovations, which was convenient since Miriam owned a historic house. He told her he had contracts with the city. He told her his family had been in Savannah for generations. That last part was true. The Cole family had been in Savannah since the 1850s. They were one of the old families. Not wealthy anymore, not the way they used to be, but connected, known, respected. Warren's mother, a woman named Cecilia Cole, still acted as though the family had a fortune, even though the fortune had been spent 2 generations ago. Cecilia lived in a rented apartment on Abercorn Street, but she dressed like she lived on a plantation. She wore hats to church. She wore gloves to brunch. She corrected people's grammar at dinner parties and referred to anyone she deemed beneath her station as those people. Cecilia did not approve of Miriam. She did not approve from the first handshake. From the moment Warren brought Miriam to meet her at the rented apartment on Abercorn Street, Cecilia had her measured and dismissed. She looked at Miriam's shoes, sensible flats from a department store. She looked at Miriam's dress, a cotton sundress she had bought on sale. She looked at Miriam's hands, which had calluses from sanding floors and painting walls, the hands of a woman who worked with her body as well as her mind. And Cecilia saw one thing: an outsider. Someone who had money, but not name. Someone who had a house, but not heritage. Someone who had bought her way onto Forsyth Park Road instead of being born there, which in Cecilia's world was the only legitimate way to arrive. Cecilia smiled at Miriam. She shook her hand with both of hers, the way Southern women do when they want you to feel welcomed and owned at the same time. She said, "How lovely to meet you, dear. Warren has told me so much about you." She served sweet tea in glasses that had the Cole family monogram etched into the crystal, even though the glasses were from a second-hand shop and Cecilia polished them herself every Sunday night. The apartment smelled like lavender sachet and furniture polish, and something else underneath, something Miriam couldn't identify at the time, but that she would later recognize as resentment. Cecilia resented Miriam because Miriam had what Cecilia wanted and couldn't have: a house, real wealth, self-made success, independence. Cecilia had spent her entire life performing the role of a wealthy Southern woman while living on a schoolteacher's pension and a dwindling inheritance that barely covered the rent. She knew every rule of etiquette and every trick of presentation. But she couldn't buy groceries without checking her bank balance first. Miriam, this woman from Jessup, this daughter of a seamstress, had 11 properties and a mansion on Forsyth Park Road. The injustice of that, in Cecilia's mind, was intolerable. And so behind that smile, behind those gloved fingers, behind the sweet tea and the monogrammed glasses, a plan began to form. Not a sudden plan, a slow one. The kind that grows the way kudzu grows, quietly, patiently, covering everything in its path until the original landscape is unrecognizable. But Miriam had no idea what was coming. Miriam and Warren married in 1993. A ceremony in the garden of the house on Forsyth Park Road, under the live oaks with the Spanish moss swaying in a warm June breeze. Miriam's parents came from Jessup. Her mother wore a dress she had sewn herself and cried through the entire ceremony. Her father shook Warren's hand with both of his, the grip of a man who was trusting this stranger with the most valuable thing in his life, and said, "Take care of my girl." Warren said, "Yes, sir." He sounded like he meant it. Maybe he did. Maybe he meant it the way he meant everything. Sincerely, in the moment, without the discipline to sustain it. They had a child, a daughter named Ivy, born October 3rd, 1995. She was a small baby, 6 pounds 4 ounces, with a round face and dark curly hair and fingers that wrapped around Miriam's thumb like she was holding on for dear life. Miriam held that baby in the hospital room with the afternoon light coming through the window and felt something shift inside her, like a wall moving to make room for something enormous. She had built houses. She had built a business. She had built a life from nothing. But this small creature breathing against her chest with a heartbeat like a hummingbird, this was the thing she had been building toward without knowing it. For the first 4 years, things were good, or they looked good, which in a marriage is not always the same thing. Warren worked on renovation projects. Miriam managed her properties, handled the accounting, dealt with tenants and contractors and city inspectors, and cared for Ivy. The house on Forsyth Park Road was full of light and noise and the smell of Miriam's mother's cinnamon cake recipe that Miriam baked every Saturday because it made the kitchen smell like Jessup and childhood and safety. Ivy took her first steps on the hardwood floors Miriam had refinished on her hands and knees. She said her first word in the kitchen, standing at the island, holding onto Miriam's pant leg, looking up with those wide, dark eyes. The word was more. Miriam laughed so hard she cried. She picked Ivy up and spun her around and said, "More what, baby? More cake? More kisses? More everything?" And Ivy laughed too. That fat, baby laugh that has no irony in it, that is just pure joy. Cecilia visited every Sunday, every single Sunday without exception. She arrived at 11 in the morning. She wore a hat and gloves regardless of the season. She brought a casserole, always a casserole, because bringing food to someone's house gives you the right to comment on their kitchen. She sat in Miriam's dining room and ate at Miriam's table and drank from Miriam's china, and she commented on everything. The curtains were the wrong shade of cream. The garden needed a professional, not just Miriam on her knees with a trowel. The nursery was cluttered with too many toys. Ivy's clothes were from department stores, not boutiques. Miriam's cinnamon cake was a bit heavy for the season. The house needed new furniture. Not that furniture. Better furniture. Furniture that reflected the Cole name and the Cole tradition of taste. Miriam tolerated it. She tolerated it the way she tolerated a splinter in her palm. It hurt, it was always there, but it wasn't worth making a scene over. She loved Warren. Warren loved his mother. And Miriam believed, truly believed, that family meant accepting people's flaws and trusting that love would smooth the rough edges over time. But the comments weren't just comments. They were seeds. And Cecilia was planting them in Warren's ear every chance she got. On Sunday afternoons, after Miriam had cleared the dishes and put Ivy down for a nap, Cecilia would sit with Warren in the parlor and talk to him in a low voice. Miriam could hear the murmur, but not the words. She assumed they were talking about family things, mother-son things. But what Cecilia was actually doing, week after week, month after month, year after year, was dismantling Miriam in Warren's mind, seed by seed. She's changing, Warren. She's too focused on the business. She doesn't understand our family's values. She came from nothing, dear, and eventually nothing pulls you back. Is she really the right mother for a Cole? Now here is where this story takes a dark turn, and I need you to stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make your blood boil. When Ivy was 4, Warren started drinking. Not the glass of wine with dinner kind of drinking. The kind where the bottles appear in places they shouldn't. Behind the books on the shelf, in the trunk of the car, tucked into the pockets of jackets hanging in the closet. The kind where the man you married slowly disappears and someone else moves into his body. Louder, meaner, with sharper edges and duller eyes. Warren said things when he drank that he wouldn't say sober. He called Miriam's properties little shacks on the south side. He called her business playing pretend real estate. He called her parents country people who don't know how things work in the real world. The words came out of his mouth slurred and sideways, but Miriam recognized the voice behind them. Those were Cecilia's words, Cecilia's phrases, Cecilia's contempt recycled through her son's drunken mouth like poison filtered through a sieve. Miriam confronted Warren. She sat him down at the kitchen table when he was sober and she said, "You need help. Please. For Ivy. For us." Warren looked at the table and said he didn't have a problem. She confronted Cecilia. She drove to the apartment on Abercorn Street and she knocked on the door and she said, "Your son is drinking himself to death. You need to stop filling his head with poison and start helping me save him." Cecilia pressed her gloved hand to her chest. She widened her eyes. She said, "I have no idea what you're talking about, dear. Warren is a Cole. Coles don't have drinking problems. Perhaps the stress of your situation is affecting your judgment." She said the word situation, the way you say the name of a disease you don't want to catch. By the time Ivy was 7, the marriage was falling apart. Warren was drinking every day. He wasn't working. His contracts had dried up because he stopped showing up to job sites. Clients called and got voicemail. Suppliers called and got excuses. His license was suspended after a DUI on Victory Drive at 2 in the afternoon. The family income came entirely from Miriam's properties. She paid the mortgage. She paid the utilities. She paid Ivy's school tuition. She paid for Warren's car insurance and the credit card debt he was accumulating at liquor stores and online poker sites without telling her. She was carrying the entire weight of the family on her back, while the family's foundation was being hollowed out from underneath. And then, on a Wednesday in November of 2002, Miriam came home from a meeting with her property manager and found a locksmith changing the locks on her own front door. Her front door. Her house. The house she had found at auction. The house she had bought with her own money. The house she had renovated with her own 2 hands. Every floor, every wall, every molding, every garden bed. The house with her name on the deed. Miriam stood on her own porch, holding her briefcase, wearing the blazer she wore to property meetings, and she said, "What are you doing?" The locksmith looked uncomfortable. He was a young man, couldn't have been more than 25, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. He said, "Ma'am, I was hired by Mr. Cole. I'm just doing my job." Warren appeared in the doorway. He was sober, for once. But his face was set in the hard expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Behind him, in the hallway, standing beneath the chandelier that Miriam had cleaned twice a year on a ladder she set up herself, stood Cecilia Cole. Arms crossed, hat on, gloves on, and a look on her face that Miriam would carry with her for 30 years. It was the look of a woman who had won a game she had been playing for a decade. "Miriam," Warren said, "you need to leave." "This is my house, Warren." "Our house," he said. "Community property. And my lawyer says that since I've been the primary resident and Ivy lives here with me, I have the right to—" "Your lawyer?" Miriam's voice was shaking now. Not with fear, with something deeper. With the particular horror of realizing that the person you share a bed with has become your adversary. "Warren, I bought this house before we were married. It's in my name. It has always been in my name." Warren looked at the floor. He rubbed the back of his neck. Then he looked at his mother, the way a child looks at a parent for permission. Cecilia stepped forward. She stepped onto the porch, into Miriam's space, and she spoke in a voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "Actually, dear," Cecilia said, "the deed was transferred to Warren's name 18 months ago. You signed the paperwork yourself, don't you remember? May of last year. Warren brought you the documents at the kitchen table. You were on the phone about a plumbing issue at one of your little buildings. You signed where he indicated. It's all perfectly legal." Miriam felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not metaphorically, literally. She felt the porch boards tilt. She reached for the railing. 18 months ago, May, Warren had brought her a stack of papers. He said they were refinancing documents, routine paperwork. The interest rate was better. She was busy. She was handling a burst pipe at the duplex on 37th Street. Water was flooding the first-floor apartment. The tenant was calling every 10 minutes. Miriam was on the phone. Warren put the papers in front of her. She signed where he pointed. Page 3, page 7, page 12. She trusted him. He was her husband. She had signed the transfer of her own house to Warren Cole. And Cecilia Cole had orchestrated the entire thing. That night, Miriam was locked out of her own home. She stood on the sidewalk outside the iron gate with her purse and the clothes on her back. Warren had kept her wallet. Her phone was inside the house, charging on the kitchen counter. She had no keys, no identification, no credit cards, no proof of anything except the calluses on her hands and the knowledge in her head, and the memory of every floorboard she had sanded, and every wall she had painted, and every nail she had hammered into the studs of this house that was no longer hers. She looked up at the house, her house. The chandelier glowed through the upstairs window. The porch light was on. The porch light she had installed herself, wiring it on a Saturday afternoon while Ivy napped in the nursery. The garden was a dark shape in the moonlight, and somewhere inside, Ivy was crying. Miriam could hear her, faintly, through the walls, through the windows, through 32 years of plaster and brick, and the silence of betrayal. Her daughter was crying for her, and Miriam couldn't get to her. She pressed her hand against the iron gate. The metal was cold. November in Savannah. She pressed her palm flat against the scrollwork, and she stood there until a police car pulled up and an officer got out and told her, politely, regretfully, that she needed to move along because the homeowner had called in a trespassing complaint. The homeowner, her husband, in her house, calling the police on her, while their daughter cried upstairs. And that single moment set off a chain of events nobody could stop. What happened over the next year was systematic destruction. It was not random. It was not careless. It was a campaign, planned and executed by Cecilia Cole with the precision of a woman who had spent a decade studying her target's weaknesses. With Warren's name on the house, the divorce proceedings gave him the leverage. Miriam hired a lawyer, but the lawyer was cheap because Miriam's bank accounts had been drained. Warren, guided by Cecilia, had moved money out of their joint accounts months before the lockout. Slow withdrawals, 500 here, 1,000 there. Transfers to an account Miriam didn't know existed. By the time Miriam was locked out, the joint account had less than $300 in it. Cecilia's plan went further. She had convinced Warren to cancel the insurance policies on Miriam's rental properties. Without insurance, the banks that held the mortgages flagged the loans as non-compliant. Warren had also let the maintenance lapse on those properties. Roof leaks went unrepaired. Plumbing issues went unfixed.
A broken furnace at the duplex on 37th Street went unreplaced through an entire winter. Tenants complained. Then tenants left. One by one, the properties that Miriam had spent 15 years building, acquiring, renovating, and nurturing emptied out. Without rental income, Miriam couldn't pay the mortgages. Without the mortgages being paid, the banks foreclosed. The divorce was finalized in 2003. Warren got the house on Forsyth Park Road. Cecilia made sure of that through the fraudulent deed transfer. Warren got primary custody of Ivy. Cecilia made sure of that too. She hired a lawyer named Arthur Dubois, a man who wore bow ties and spoke in paragraphs, and who argued in family court that Miriam was emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible and unfit to provide a suitable home environment. These were Cecilia's words.
A neighbor named Mrs. Toussaint would later testify under oath that she had overheard Cecilia in her apartment rehearsing these exact phrases with Warren, coaching him on what to say, which facial expressions to make, how to pause for effect when describing Miriam's erratic behavior. Miriam stood in that courtroom in a borrowed blazer with her parents behind her and listened to a judge award custody of her daughter to the man who had stolen her house. Her lawyer objected. The objections were noted and overruled. The system moved on. The paperwork was filed. And Miriam walked out of the courthouse into the November sunlight and sat on a bench in Chippewa Square and stared at the sky for an hour without moving. Miriam lost her properties one by one over the next 2 years. The duplexes, the small apartment buildings, the commercial space on Bull Street where the coffee shop used to be. Without income from the rentals, she couldn't pay the mortgages. The banks foreclosed.
The buildings she had painted and sanded and plumbed and wired and loved were sold at auction to developers who didn't care about the crown molding she had restored or the original hardwood she had preserved. They tore the buildings down and put up condominiums with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and no history and no soul. Everything Miriam had built over 15 years of careful, disciplined, brilliant work was gone in 24 months. 15 years to build, 24 months to destroy. That's the math of injustice. It adds up fast going down. By 2005, Miriam Cole had nothing. No house, no properties, no savings, no car, no phone, no husband, no daughter, no address. Nothing except a torn coat she got from a church donation bin and a cardboard sign she wrote with a marker she found on the ground outside a convenience store, and a spot on the sidewalk outside the iron gate of the house she had bought and renovated and loved and lost. She went there on the first morning because she wanted to be near Ivy. She couldn't see Ivy. The court order prohibited contact. Warren had gotten a restraining order. But Miriam could hear Ivy sometimes, playing in the garden behind the gate, her voice high and small and perfect, calling out to someone, laughing at something, singing a song she'd learned at school. Miriam would sit on the sidewalk and close her eyes and listen, and press her hand against the iron bars, and imagine she was inside the gate instead of outside it. She went back the next day, and the next, and the next, for 30 years. 30 years is 10,950 days. Miriam sat on that sidewalk for approximately 11 hours a day. That is 120,000 hours.
She sat through 30 summers of Savannah heat, the kind that makes the air visible and the sidewalk hot enough to burn through your shoes.
She sat through 30 winters, some mild and some bitter, the kind where the wind comes off the river and cuts through a coat like it isn't there. She sat through rain that soaked her to the skin, and she sat through days so beautiful that tourists walked past her taking photos of the oak trees and the Spanish moss and never noticed the woman on the ground. People walked past her every day, thousands of people over 30 years, dog walkers, joggers, tourists, neighbors, business people, students. They walked past and they looked through her the way you look through a window. The glass is there, but you see what's behind it. She was invisible. She was the gate woman, a piece of the landscape. But every morning at 7 o'clock, Miriam Cole sat down on that sidewalk and she pressed her hand against the iron bars and she whispered, "I'm here, baby. Mama's right here." She said it every single day for 30 years. Whether Ivy was inside or not, whether anyone could hear or not, she said it because saying it was the only thing she had left, the only action available to her, the only proof that she was still a mother. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. Now let me tell you about Desiree Palmer, because Desiree is the reason this story doesn't end on that sidewalk. And that woman deserved so much better than an ending on a sidewalk. Desiree was 28 years old. She was a lawyer, but not the kind of lawyer who wears expensive suits and drives a BMW and takes 3-hour lunches. Desiree was a legal aid lawyer at the Chatham County Legal Services Office on Montgomery Street. She helped people who couldn't afford representation, eviction cases, custody disputes, disability claims, the cases nobody else wanted because nobody else was paying for them. She earned $42,000 a year. She drove a car with 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on so long she'd named it Gerald. She wore blazers from consignment shops and flats she resold herself. And she cared about justice the way some people care about breathing, not as a philosophy, but as a physical need. Desiree noticed Miriam on a Tuesday in September. She was walking past the gate on Forsyth Park Road on her way to a client meeting. She had walked past that gate dozens of times. She had seen the homeless woman dozens of times. But on this particular Tuesday, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. She saw Miriam press her hand against the iron bars. She saw the way Miriam closed her eyes. She saw the way Miriam's lips moved. And something about that gesture, the tenderness of it, the familiarity, made Desiree stop. "Ma'am," Desiree said, "are you all right?" Miriam opened her eyes. She looked at Desiree. She looked at her for a long time, the way a person looks at someone when they've been invisible for 30 years and someone finally sees them. "I used to live here," Miriam said. Most people would have nodded politely and walked away. Homeless people say a lot of things. But Desiree was not most people. Desiree sat down on the sidewalk next to Miriam in her consignment shop blazer and her 200,000-mile car shoes, and she said, "Tell me everything." And Miriam did. She told Desiree about Jessup, about her parents, about college, about the properties, about the house, about Warren, about Cecilia, about the papers she signed, about the locks being changed, about the divorce, about losing Ivy, about 30 years on the sidewalk. She told her everything in a voice that was cracked and rough from years of disuse, because nobody had asked her to speak in a very long time. Desiree listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't doubt. She listened the way a good lawyer listens, with her whole mind engaged and her instincts firing. And when Miriam finished, Desiree said 3 words that changed everything. "I'll look into it." She went back to her office. She pulled the property records for the house on Forsyth Park Road. And what she found made her sit down very slowly in her desk chair and stare at the screen. The deed had been transferred to Warren Cole in 2001, but the transfer document was irregular. The notary stamp was from a notary public who had lost their license 6 months before the transfer date. The witness signatures were illegible and unverifiable, and beneath the layers of recorded transfers, amendments, and mortgage documents, buried under 30 years of paper, was the original deed from 1991. Miriam Atchison,
Sole owner. Fee simple absolute. The original deed had never been properly superseded. The transfer to Warren was legally defective, which meant, in the eyes of the law, the house had never stopped belonging to Miriam. Desiree pulled more records. She found the divorce file. She found the custody ruling.
She found the financial disclosures Warren had filed, which listed the house as his sole property. She found the bank records showing the systematic draining of Miriam's accounts. She found the property tax records showing that Warren had been paying taxes on a house he didn't legally own. And she found something else, something that made her pick up the phone and call her supervisor. Cecilia Cole's name appeared on the notary document as a witness. Cecilia Cole, who was not a notary and had no legal authority to witness a property transfer. Cecilia Cole, who had signed her name in neat cursive on a document that stole a house from a woman and gave it to her son. What Desiree was about to discover would change everything. Desiree built the case over 3 months. She worked nights and weekends. She worked through Thanksgiving dinner, sitting at her sister's kitchen table with a laptop and a stack of records, while her nieces ate turkey around her. She pulled every document she could find: property records, tax filings, court transcripts, notary logs from the state licensing board. She interviewed neighbors who remembered Miriam from before. An elderly man named Mr. Beaumont who lived across the street and who told Desiree, over a cup of coffee on his porch, that he remembered Miriam renovating that house. He remembered the sound of the sander running at 7 in the morning. He remembered seeing her on a ladder painting the trim. He remembered the day the locks were changed, because he saw Miriam standing on the sidewalk that evening holding her purse and crying, and he almost went to help her. But Warren came to the gate and told Mr. Beaumont to go back inside, and Mr. Beaumont was 70 at the time and didn't want trouble, so he went inside, and he had regretted it every day since. Desiree found Miriam's former property manager, a woman named Gail Hebert, who had worked with Miriam throughout the 90s. Gail confirmed everything. Miriam was the sole owner. Miriam made every decision. Miriam signed every contract. Miriam was sharp, organized, disciplined. That woman could look at a building and see what it could become before anyone else could, Gail said. She had a gift, and somebody took it from her. Desiree found a retired family court judge named Judge Beatrice Fontaine, who agreed to review the divorce case file pro bono. Judge Fontaine read the file over a weekend and called Desiree on Monday morning. Her voice was tight, controlled. The voice of a woman who had spent 40 years in family court and thought she had seen everything. "This custody ruling is deeply troubling," Judge Fontaine said. "The financial disclosures filed by Mr. Cole are inconsistent with the property records. He claims sole ownership of the Forsyth Park Road property, but the original deed was never properly superseded. The transfer document is irregular, and the testimony used to establish Ms. Cole as unfit was, at minimum, coached, and at worst, perjured." But the biggest thing Desiree found was Ivy. She found Ivy Cole, now Ivy Cole Patterson, in Charleston, South Carolina. Ivy was 32 years old. She worked as a social worker at a community health center. She was married to a man named Terrence, who taught high school history. She had a 2-year-old daughter named Sage. She had not seen her mother in 30 years. She had been told, by Warren and by Cecilia, that Miriam had abandoned her, that Miriam had left voluntarily, that Miriam had chosen the streets over her family, that Miriam was mentally ill, unstable, possibly dangerous, that Miriam didn't want her, that Miriam had never come back because Miriam didn't care. Ivy had believed this. She had believed it her entire life because she was 4 years old when it happened. And 4-year-olds believe what they are told by the people who put food in front of them and tuck them in at night. She believed it at 10, when she wrote a school essay about her family and didn't mention her mother. She believed it at 18, when she graduated high school and looked at the empty seat where a mother should have been sitting. She believed it at 25, when she had Sage and held her for the first time and felt something enormous move inside her and thought, how could anyone walk away from this? She believed it until Desiree Palmer called her on a Thursday evening in September and said, in a voice that was steady and careful and clear, "Miss Patterson, my name is Desiree Palmer. I'm a legal aid attorney in Savannah. I need to tell you something about your mother, something that is going to be very difficult to hear."
Ivy was standing in her kitchen in Charleston.
Sage was in the high chair eating applesauce. Terrence was grading papers in the living room.
The evening light was coming through the window over the sink. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And then everything changed. "Your mother did not abandon you," Desiree said. "She was defrauded. She was locked out of her own house by your father and your grandmother through a forged property transfer. She lost everything. And for the last 30 years, she has been sitting outside the gate of that house on Forsyth Park Road. Every single day, 11 hours a day, for 30 years. She never left, Ivy. She has been right there the entire time." The line was silent for so long that Desiree checked her phone to make sure the call was still connected. "She was there?" Ivy whispered. Her voice had changed. It had become the voice of a 4-year-old girl standing at an upstairs window looking down at the sidewalk, seeing a shape there that she had been told was nobody. "This whole time?"
She was right there? "Every single day," Desiree said. "For 30 years. She never left. Not once." Ivy hung up. She put Sage in Terrence's arms. She said, "I have to go to Savannah." Terrence looked at her face and didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Drive safe." Ivy drove from Charleston to Savannah in 3 hours. She broke every speed limit on I-95. The sun was going down when she crossed the Savannah River. The city was turning gold and pink. She parked on Forsyth Park Road at 4 in the afternoon. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. She got out of the car and she walked to the gate, and she saw her. A woman sitting on the sidewalk with a cardboard sign and a paper cup. A thin woman in a faded coat held together with safety pins. A woman with gray hair under a brown knitted cap. A woman who was pressing her hand against the iron bars of a gate with her eyes closed. Ivy stood there. Her car keys dug into her palm because she was squeezing them so hard. Her chest was so tight she couldn't take a full breath. She looked at this woman. She looked at the hands pressed against the gate. Thin hands now. Bony. Swollen knuckles. Cracked nails. But still pressed flat against the iron. Still reaching. And Ivy remembered something from so far back it was more feeling than memory. More warmth than image. She remembered small hands. Warm hands. Hands that held her when she was scared of thunder and the lights went out. Hands that smelled like cinnamon and garden soil and something sweet she could never name, but that she now understood was simply the smell of her mother. She remembered being lifted, being swung, being held against a chest that was soft and warm and safe. She remembered the word, more. She didn't remember saying it, but she remembered the laughter that came after. Her mother's laughter. A sound she hadn't heard in 30 years, but that she recognized the way you recognize your own heartbeat. "Mama?" Ivy said. Her voice broke on the word like a window hit by a stone. Miriam opened her eyes. She looked at the woman standing in front of her. She looked at the dark, curly hair, the wide, dark eyes, the round face that was no longer a baby's face, but that still carried the shape of the child Miriam had held in the hospital 32 years ago. The child whose fingers had wrapped around Miriam's thumb like she was holding on for dear life. Miriam's hand slid off the gate. Her body went still. Every muscle in her locked in place, the way a body locks when the mind cannot process what the eyes are seeing. And then something broke. Something that had been holding for 30 years. A wall. A dam. A structure made entirely of endurance and grief and the daily discipline of getting up and walking to that gate and sitting down and pressing her hand against the iron and whispering to a daughter she could hear but could not reach. "Ivy," Miriam whispered. "Baby, is that you?" Ivy dropped to her knees on the sidewalk. She grabbed Miriam's hands. She held them the way Miriam used to hold hers, tight, complete, with everything. "I'm here, Mama," Ivy said. "I'm right here. I never knew. They told me you left. They told me you didn't want me. I believed them because I was 4 years old and I didn't know any better. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." Miriam pulled Ivy against her chest and held her. She held her on that sidewalk, on that spot where she had sat for 30 years, in front of that gate, in front of that house, and she rocked her back and forth the way she had rocked her as a baby. And she didn't say anything because there were no words in any language that could hold what she was feeling. She just held on.
and Ivy held on. And the people walking past on Forsyth Park Road stopped and stared, and for once, for the first time in 30 years, somebody noticed. The legal case moved fast after that. Desiree filed a motion to void the fraudulent property transfer. She filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding Cecilia's involvement in the notary fraud. She filed a motion to reopen the custody case based on new evidence of perjury in Warren's financial disclosures. Warren hired a lawyer. The lawyer took one look at the evidence and advised Warren to settle. Warren refused. Cecilia told him to fight. Warren fought. The case went before a judge. The judge looked at the original deed. The judge looked at the fraudulent transfer document. The judge looked at the notary records. The judge looked at the bank statements showing the systematic draining of Miriam's accounts. The judge looked at 30 years of property tax records paid by a man who didn't own the property. And the judge looked at Warren Cole and Cecilia Cole sitting on one side of the courtroom, and Miriam Cole and Ivy and Desiree Palmer sitting on the other. The judge voided the transfer. The house on Forsyth Park Road was restored to Miriam Atchison Cole. Every square foot, every column, every brick, every board she had sanded, every wall she had painted, every garden bed she had planted, every piece of brass hardware she had polished until it gleamed. It was hers. It had always been hers. The law said so, the deed said so, and now the court said so. The judge also referred the case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation of fraud, forgery, and perjury. The judge also ordered Warren to pay restitution for 30 years of property taxes he had paid on a house he didn't legally own, and for the rental income Miriam had lost from her foreclosed properties as a direct result of his financial sabotage during the marriage. Warren said nothing in the courtroom. He sat at the defendant's table with his head down, staring at his hands, which were resting on the table, palms down. He was 58 now, gray, thin. The drinking had carved lines into his face that made him look 10 years older. The charm was gone. The molasses voice was gone. What was left was a man sitting in a courtroom listening to the consequences of choices he had let his mother make for him. Cecilia was sitting behind him in the gallery. She was 84 years old. She wore a hat. Of course she wore a hat. Navy blue with a small brim. She wore gloves. Of course she wore gloves. White cotton, pressed. She sat with her back straight and her chin up, the posture of a woman who had spent 84 years performing the role of a person who mattered. She looked at the judge. She looked at the documents. She looked at Desiree Palmer in her consignment shop blazer. And then she looked at Miriam. Miriam was sitting at the plaintiff's table. She was wearing a dress that Ivy had bought her. The first new dress she had worn in 30 years. It was simple, blue, clean. She was still thin, still small. The knitted cap was gone. Her gray hair was washed and combed and cut short. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, not the practiced straightness of Cecilia's posture, but the natural straightness of a woman who had spent 30 years sitting on concrete and had learned to hold herself up without anything to lean on. Miriam stood up. Desiree touched her arm, but Miriam shook her head. She had something to say. She looked at Cecilia Cole. She looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had orchestrated the theft of her house, the destruction of her business, the loss of her daughter, and 30 years of homelessness. She looked at those eyes, and she said something that Cecilia Cole would hear echoing in her head for whatever years she had left on this earth. You didn't take my house, Cecilia. You can't take what's built into the foundation. A house isn't the deed. A house isn't the name on a piece of paper. A house is the woman who sanded every floor on her hands and knees, the woman who planted the garden, the woman who polished the brass until it gleamed. You just made me sit outside of it for 30 years. But I never left. I was there every morning at 7 and every evening at 6. The deed never changed. The foundation never moved. And the woman you tried to erase is still standing here, on her own property, on her own ground, in her own name. And you, Cecilia, are the one who has to leave. The courtroom was silent. The court reporter's fingers were still. The bailiff by the door looked at the floor. Desiree Palmer pressed her hand over her mouth. Cecilia sat down slowly. She didn't speak. She looked at her gloves. She pulled them off, one finger at a time, and set them in her lap. And she didn't speak again. Miriam walked through her own gate that evening. She walked up the driveway, under the live oaks, through the Spanish moss. She climbed the porch steps.
She touched the brass hardware in the front door, the hardware she had polished 30 years ago until it gleamed. It was tarnished now, dull, neglected, but solid, still there. She opened the door. She stepped into the foyer. She looked up at the chandelier, the curved staircase, the 12-foot ceilings, the hardwood floors she had refinished on her hands and knees. She pressed her hand against the wall. The plaster was cool, solid. The same wall she had touched the day she got the keys, 32 years ago, when she was 31 years old and the future was a wide-open road. "This is mine," Miriam said. The same words, the same wall, 32 years apart. But this time, Ivy was standing behind her. And this time, Miriam was not alone. In the weeks that followed, Miriam and Ivy repaired the house together. They repainted the porch. They replanted the garden. They polished the brass until it gleamed again. Ivy moved from Charleston to Savannah. She took the bedroom she had slept in as a child, the one with the window that overlooked the garden. She stood in that room and looked at the walls, and she remembered things she didn't know she remembered. The color of the curtains, the sound of her mother humming in the next room, the smell of cinnamon. Desiree came by every Saturday. She brought legal updates and coffee and a stubborn refusal to be thanked. "I did my job," she said every time Miriam tried to express gratitude. "Your job was harder. You sat outside your own house for 30 years and never gave up. All I did was read some paperwork." Miriam laughed at that. It was a rough laugh, unpracticed, rusty from decades of silence. But it was real, and it got stronger over time, the way all real things do. On a Sunday morning in December, 6 months after the court ruling, Miriam sat on her porch in a rocking chair that Ivy had bought for her. A new chair. A good chair. She held a cup of coffee in both hands. The garden smelled like jasmine and the particular clean scent of Savannah in winter. The gate was open. Miriam had removed the lock. She said she didn't need it anymore. Ivy came out to the porch with her own coffee and sat in the chair next to her. They rocked in silence for a while. The oak trees swayed. The moss drifted. A mockingbird sang its catalog from the garden wall. "Mama," Ivy said, "why didn't you ever leave? Why did you stay on that sidewalk all those years? You could have gone somewhere else. You could have started over." Miriam looked at the garden, the new plants, the turned soil, the brass doorknob catching the morning light. She took a sip of her coffee. "Because you were inside," Miriam said simply. "Even after you grew up and left, the house was still you. Every room I painted, every floor I sanded, every seed I planted. It was all for you, baby. Leaving that sidewalk would have been like leaving you. And I already lost you once. I wasn't going to lose you again. Not even the idea of you." Ivy set down her coffee. She reached over and took her mother's hand. Miriam's hand was thin, rough. The knuckles were swollen. The nails were short. But it was warm, and it was steady, still steady after everything. "You know what I think?" Ivy said. "I think the house knew. I think it was waiting for you the whole time, holding itself together until you came back." Miriam smiled, a real smile, wide and warm and full of something that looked a lot like peace. "Houses don't wait, baby," Miriam said. "People do, and I'm very good at waiting." They sat on that porch together for the rest of the morning, mother and daughter, 30 years apart, together now. The gate open, the door unlocked, the coffee warm, the mockingbird singing. And inside the house, on the wall of the foyer, Miriam had hung a framed copy of the original deed, the one with her name on it.
The one that had been buried under 30 years of paper and lies and silence.
The one that had been there the whole time, underneath everything, waiting to be found. Just like Miriam.
Thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with a friend. Drop a comment and tell us what part hit you the hardest. We'll see you in the next one.